universities have never been equal, equitable institutions. They have been founded on principles of inequality, socioeconomic backgrounds being superior to others. I'm really convinced that if we do not have this conversation about who holds the power in the university, who is privileged, who benefits from the ongoing inequality, we will never change it.
You're listening to Parallax from Radcliffe Cardiology in association with makeadent.org. Here is your host, Ankur Kalra, MD.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Parallax. So this is a unique episode. It's an important episode. It's an episode which will discuss an important topic, and this topic is unfortunately prevalent within academic medicine and science, at large. And I decided to cover this topic because I stumbled upon a paper on Twitter, thanks to Dr. Naidu. And I will tag him on this episode once this comes out, who actually shared this paper on Twitter amongst the cardiology community, which, talks about bullying as a tool for advancement within academia. And I have with me the honor of having the authors of this paper, which was published in Nature now 2 years ago. And they can correct me if I'm wrong. But I have Susanne Täuber. Dr. Täuber is an associate professor of organizational behavior. And with Dr. Täuber is her co-author, Dr. Mahmoudi. And Dr. Mahmoudi is an assistant professor of radiology and precision medicine or precision health at Michigan State University. And they published this provocative piece in Nature now almost 2 years ago, which talks about bullying as a tool for advancement within academia, career advancement. So with that introduction, Susanne and Morteza, welcome on the show, and thank you so much for doing this for us.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Ankur. Nice to be here.
So I'm going to just dive right in. Susanne, you published this paper as first author, and congratulations for getting such a provocative piece accepted in Nature. And we will share the PDF or the link to this paper in our show notes when the episode comes out. What prompted you to write on this topic? Curious to know. And again, kudos to you and congratulations for getting this published in Nature.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ankur. I mean, the equal amount of credits have to go to Morteza, of course. I think we wrote this paper out of an increasing understanding of the nature of bullying in academia. I mean, there's a lot of talk over the past years about why this behavior exists and how can we sort of change this behavior. And I think what Morteza and I both experience also in our work in the academic parity movement, where we speak with a lot of people who have been targeted by bullying behavior in academia, is that people would always sort of excuse it. So there's this star academic, and unfortunately this person, even though it's a brilliant scientist, but this person somehow is socially awkward, right? But then if you put together the literature on bullying in academia, and if you look at all the reports we now have, all the knowledge we have, and you see that this behavior is still persisting, it sort of prompted us to look at it from a totally different angle. And people have done that before us, and I think what made this piece fly so well is that we just put it into very few words, right?
Yes, I mean, the piece is a short piece. I think it's about 750 words, very powerful words. Morteza, yes, I'd like for you to chime in. And, again, as Susanne mentioned, congratulations for getting this piece published in Nature. And it's a provocative piece. It's a short piece. It's very well written. It just hits the nail on its head. And I think what I want to ask you is, when you submitted this to, well, first off, when you finished writing this piece and you were thinking about where to put this in for publication, was Nature your first choice? And then once Nature demonstrated interest in putting this piece, out to a publication, what were some of the comments that you received from the editorial board and from the editor-in-chief? So walk me through the process of putting this together to having this go through peer review, because some of the academics would be peer reviewers as well, right? Some of these bullies who are academics who are part of the peer review process, and then having this go through peer review in Nature and then getting it published. Walk me through that process.
Yeah, sure. So one corrections I have to make is that the piece has been published in Nature Human Behavior and not Nature. So just give you a little bit of introduction here about how we basically started the process. I mean, my field of interest is in nanomedicine and regenerative medicine. And based on the nature of my research, I had to basically get a complementary training from different fields of science. That basically was the major reason that I traveled a lot and visited different universities, got training from them. And I was in different scientific disciplines as well, because like I mentioned, it's needed to kind of connect the dots in the field of in multidisciplinary field like nanomedicine and regenerative medicine. So I have been in Ireland, I have been in Switzerland and different places in the United States. No matter where basically I was doing research or getting training about different issues, I always saw people suffering from a wide range of academic bullying and harassment. So back in 2018, I decided to finally write a piece at Nature about the difficulties that international students have in reporting bullying and harassment behaviors, because the pattern was simple. Universities almost always encourage targets to speak up. They promise to back them up. But this is just the policies. When you see the patterns and the outcomes, it turned out that almost all of the people that speak up, they are the one who basically pay the price. And most of them basically finally resign their positions or get fired from their positions. So I decided to write that piece. The reason was that international students or minorities were kind of more vulnerable to those behaviors. So I wrote a correspondence to Nature. It was few paragraphs. It was even a quarter of the Nature Human Behavior piece. So within 2 weeks, I've received a huge number of response from different members of the scientific community. And the number of response were at least twofold higher than all of the responses I've got from my scientific papers all combined. So that clearly showed how important the issue of academic bullying and harassment was in the field. So with the help of other colleagues, we started to basically study the issue of academic bullying and harassment in more detail. And I was very fortunate to basically came across Susanne's work, and we basically connected, and we decided to write a piece about some of the root causes and the basically academic settings that bullies can thrive, and why we have this problem for a long time in academia. So that's why we basically identified one powerful tool that many bullies use to get to the top and be kind of untouchable and remove all of the, I would say, noises from the department, which comes from talented scientist who wants to do things right. So we prepared the piece and we thought about where we want to basically submit that piece. We decided to go to Nature Human Behavior as a first option because it was very related. I mean, the journal's scope was very related to what we were talking about. And we decided to submit it as a correspondence. So the correspondence basically is a type of manuscript at Nature and its sister journals that the review process basically would be performed on editor's decision. So if they decide to send the piece to a review paper, to a peer review process, they do. Otherwise, if they find basically the piece very interesting and timely and robust and powerful, they basically go directly to the editorial revision processes and basically accept it without peer review processes. So Susanne and I went through at least 2 rounds of editorial decision to make it more concise and more right to the point. And the piece finally got accepted after, I think, if I'm not mistaken, 3 months after basically submission. We know that, at the time, we knew that basically the piece gets huge attention because that was the behavior that we saw in different departments, different cultures, and different countries. And we also took a great risk to publish such a thing, as you can imagine. And this is basically what happened to Susanne's career because of publishing similar things. It basically provoked some people and manager at university level, and basically her position got in huge danger. So we got 2 kinds of feedback. Almost over, I would say 99% were thank you letters that we received for publishing such a thing. And I would say less than 1% of the papers of the feedback came from a few kind of people who were not very supportive, who tried to justify what you are describing here is part of academic freedom. Like Susanne mentioned, some people try to justify bullying and harassment behaviors under umbrella of academic freedom, which is kind of inappropriate.
This is very enlightening. Thank you for going over the process with me. And I'm going to have both you and Susanne answer this question, but I'm going to go with Susanne first. Susanne, why do you think these bullies consistently across the spectrum of cultures and countries and universities and organizations and institutions, why do these bullies find their way to the top consistently? That's what bothers me.
Yeah, that's a good question. We have tried to describe this process in this correspondence piece, but of course it's a very short piece. But in a sense, what you see is an interaction between the organizational context, so how an organization is made, and certain personality traits that get attracted or not attracted to this organization. And academia, I think, across the globe by now is just an organization that is very attractive to people with personality traits that personality psychologists call the dark triad, which consists of narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. And these are people that sort of naturally gravitate towards positions of power. And they thrive in organizations where there is very little accountability. So academia is basically it's like a paradise for these kinds of people, right? Because they have the opportunity to gain a lot of positional power over people. So what you probably have heard a lot is that this person can make or break a career, and usually it's just one person. So people are in this extreme dependency on just one person. And so this is why actually I think if we want to change it, we really need to change the structure of academia. The root cause is the hierarchy, the competitiveness, and the dependency. And if you look at any policy at any university, there is not a single policy I have come across that actually is challenging these root causes.
Morteza, what do you think? What do you have to add to what Susanne has just told us? And, that's very honestly and very eloquently described. So thank you for the description. But Morteza, I'd like to hear your viewpoint as well.
Yeah, I can't agree more with what Susanne mentioned. The only thing I would add is that the history of responding to perpetrators and targets also help bullies to thrive again in the system, and that's why they continue to do the same thing. If you look at the scandals of academic bullying that comes to the news, you see that perpetrators do bullying and harassment behaviors even for decades, and there are lots of examples out there. If you make a fast search on Google, you see a couple of those examples. Perpetrators do the bullying and harassment behaviors even for decades. There are hundreds of complaints to the universities. None of them basically support targets and face perpetrators. So you can imagine the kind of signal it sends to other perpetrators in the system, that they get protected by the universities. Even the legal costs get covered by public money because their interests are intertwined with universities' interests. Whereas if a target wants to get a support from legal entities, they need to basically cover all of their huge expenses. And those news, like I mentioned, send a very clear and negative signal to targets that they are the one who pay the price of bullying. So it encourages the culture of using the code of silence. So Susanne and I wrote a follow-up piece on science, again, last year. The title was Disrupting Targets' Dependency to Perpetrators. So this is one of the reasons that, again, we have this issue in the system. One reason, like Susanne mentioned, is the personality of the perpetrators and how basically the academic setting helped them to thrive. The other reason is that targets have dependency to the perpetrator. Imagine if a person is doing their PhDs and then they are at the fourth year of their PhDs and they receive huge range of bullying and harassment behaviors, they try to use code of silence. The reason is simple, because then if they complain, they need to basically get away of all of their achievements in the 4 years of being in the PhD and doing research in the field. And the unfortunate other thing is that the perpetrators make sure to retaliate if someone speaks up. They even follow targets after they basically change the institution to make sure that they destroy their career. So they create a culture of fear among targets, so they don't speak up. So the synergistic role of the academic setting, which helps bullies to thrive, and also force targets to use code of silence with various strategies. That makes basically this problem exist and grow in science.
It's sad on multiple levels, right? It's sad for the science. It's sad for the targets. It is also sad because the amount of emotional pain that the target goes through can't be described in words. I'm sure both you and Susanne have experienced this, and so have I. And I can attest to the fact that the emotional pain is not trivial.
Yeah, you're right, and I can't agree more. I would say the other sad thing is that our understanding is that the adverse effect of bullying and harassment only goes to targets, but this is not the case. It goes to targets, it goes to their families, it goes to even people of the circle of the influence of that particular person that receive bullying and harassment like behaviors. You are in the medical setting and you know that like toxic environment can increase errors in like medical decisions. So even patients can pay the price of a toxic environment. The other issue is that we have evidences that even scientific integrity and, like you mentioned, scientific progresses are also affected by bullying behaviors. We have evidences that some bullies force targets to manipulate data in a way that they want because they need to get grants, they need to publish in top-tier journals. So they want to see like cherry pick up results, if not manipulated results. So all of them can cause serious issues to both scientific evolution and scientific integrity as well. So I think that angle needs to be portrayed a little bit better to the entire scientific community and all of the stakeholders, so they don't think that the issues just go to the targets. All of us as a member of the scientific community pay the price of the toxic behavior in academia. The other sad thing is that if the targets remain unhealed, there's a great risk that they do the bullying behaviors once they get to the position of power. And imagine if the unhealed targets basically goes to other sectors like industries, they can also make that problem and propagate that problem to other sectors as well. So I would say universities needs to understand that if they continue to support bullies, they would be a factories of future bullies rather than progression of science.
Maybe I can add to that what Morteza just said. There's also a great cost for society, right? I mean, universities are publicly funded. So we are basically, as taxpayers, funding bullies. We are funding, fake science, as Morteza said. We are funding the bullying of targets out of the academy. We know, for instance, Morteza was mentioning that before, we know that members of minoritized and underrepresented groups are much more likely to become targets of bullying. But these people also have certain research areas and interests that they do research about, like political identity, gender inequality, social justice. So these research fields also become sort of under-investigated, underfunded. Kozlowski et al. Published a very interesting paper on that last year, showing that, for instance, if everyone would just become professor according to the U.S. census, right, in the distribution of who has finished their PhD, we would have, for instance, like I'm not sure about the correct number, but I think something like 25% more papers on gender equality. So we are actually losing insights also into some of the most pressing problems that we are facing as humanity right now. So the problem is really, really huge. The costs are for everyone, and the benefits are just for the few people that call themselves star academics, and often based on research and ideas they stole from others.
Yeah, it's a perpetrating problem. It's sort of like a chain reaction that once it sets itself off, it's just hard to get a handle and control it. And you've thanks for bringing the other paper to my attention, Morteza. You said that you published a paper in Science which talks about disrupting this chain reaction and disrupting this vicious cycle, which it sounds like to me self-perpetuating. How do we do that? So we know there's a problem. We know, I'm sure we ourselves and many included know targets and know their stories and know that they are genuine people and the stories are genuine. And we know how much problem this causes downstream, not only to targets, not only to their families, not only to their friends, to their careers, but to society at large. How do we control this problem?
So in my opinion, and I think Susanne would also agree as well, is that we need help from other stakeholders as well. Because like I mentioned, universities by themselves have limited interest in fully addressing the academic bullying and harassment behaviors. The reason is that they don't have budget to heal targets. They don't have budget or allocated budget to support targets. Most of the perpetrators are well-funded. They bring funding, huge funding to the universities. Universities get paid. They get overhead. So it's hard for them to kind of make a fair and unbiased response to perpetrators because their reputation is also on stake. So I would say if other stakeholders like funding agencies truly come to the equation and enforce universities to fairly consider the bullying behaviors, at least the investigation process and facing to the perpetrators and supporting targets, then the situation would be different. And we have good successful example of that in the scientific community. For example, in the UK, we have a major funding agencies called Wellcome Trust. And they basically got funding from a perpetrator. And there was a multi-million pounds of funding. And they mandate universities to also expose and report anti-bullying records of the PIs to the funding agencies. Otherwise, they don't support universities. They don't support PIs. They don't fund them. And this is the progresses that NIH also started a few years ago. So they basically created a direct line for targets whose PIs have NIH funding. So they can basically do independent investigation on the cases and they take away funding from perpetrators. So that basically would help a lot. Or if other stakeholders like the university ranking decision makers, then I think universities has less reasons to support perpetrators because they get, most of their revenues, either financial or by absorbing great scientists, comes from their reputations. So if anti-bullying record of the universities basically have a role in their ranking, then the situation would be different. For example, we ran a global survey a few years ago to better understand contextual behaviors of academic bullying and harassment and where basically those bullying behaviors are more kind of frequent. And we noticed that the high-ranked universities are the worst in the frequency and different types of academic bullying and harassment. So imagine if anti-bullying records then come to the equation of the ranking, then it can make a huge difference on the university's mission to basically create the safe environment for everyone. The other entity that we currently lack is an entity that can have access to the reports of internal investigation on academic bullying and harassment by universities, because they basically do internal investigations. Then there would be no report out of that. So all of them remains confidential at university level. You can imagine that there would be no accountability on the members of the investigation committee. Even for the case of scandals of academic bullying that came to the news, I have never witnessed a statement from the members of the investigation committee that why they covered bullies over hundreds of complaints over 2 decades. How that could happen? How that could even be happening at the university level, and no one is accountable for their actions. So if such an entity make the members of the investigation committee members accountable for their actions, then again, the universities has less interest in covering up for bullies.
Yeah, no, these are some great thoughts. And I just don't know if there will ever be a day where I see all these implemented, but certainly are great solutions for universities to consider, for academia to consider, for deans and provosts, what have you, to consider. Susanne, I do want to talk about your experience, if you permit. And also want to talk about the academic parity movement. Do you want to talk us through some of these, some of these core discussion points for this podcast?
Yes, I can do that, Ankur. I wanted to briefly come back to what you just said, because I'm hearing this sort of skepticism in your voice, right? Will we ever see these changes? And I think this is so important because universities always claim that all they need is better policies, right? But all the policies sort of neglect the fact that universities have never been equal, equitable institutions. They have been founded on principles of inequality, on certain races and genders and, socioeconomic backgrounds being superior to others. So I'm really convinced that if we do not have this conversation about who holds the power in the university, who is privileged, who benefits from the ongoing inequality, we will never change it. So I'm really waiting for the courageous administrator or university president who's going to say, and from now on, we're doing things differently. Because I share your sentiment, Ankur, that with policies and good advice, all the insights we are sharing all the time, we're just not getting there. We are not, to speak in your podcast, we are not making a dent yet. So I hope that also with the academic parity movement, over time we can make this dent. So that was just about this, and then about my case. So I've been fired on International Women's Day this year on March 8th from the university because in 2019 I've written an essay exactly about that, about the discrepancy between their gender equality policy and the daily inequality practices that I was experiencing as a scholar there. And ever since that essay was published, I was very much like what Morteza described before. I was basically chased down, hunted, until they finally managed to fire me. And this is, of course, one of the ways in which this system sort of maintains itself and reproduces itself, namely by silencing and making invisible the critical voices. And it's really, really difficult to sort of navigate this, because if you want to stay in the system, you sort of have to really tread very carefully, and oftentimes so carefully that you're not actually able to make any change, right? And if you speak up critically, it can happen to you that the system will just get rid of you. And this is what happened to me.
Yeah, it's sort of an uphill battle for the change makers, isn't it? That history has shown that to us time and again. And I think then, I'm talking to someone who is a professor of organizational behavior, but, this is my take on it. I think there's some of us who would be quiet and sit down, and then there are some of us who would make this a cause and a mission for our life, right? And I congratulate you both for treading the more arduous path of making it a mission for your life, both you and Morteza. And you brought up Make a Dent, which is my nonprofit organization, which, certainly supports equality and, equitable opportunities for people across the spectrum of, gender, race, socioeconomic status, what have you. And also do some, work not only in the science space, but also in, disparities and diversity and equity and inclusion. So, as an extension to this conversation, we can have this conversation off the line, but if there's anything makeadent.org can do to support the academic parity movement, consider me an ally and a colleague. Any closing remarks from you, Morteza, and then I'll ask for some closing remarks from Susanne. But thank you again for being so responsive to a cold email from me and demonstrating interest to come on the podcast, which is largely downloaded by cardiologists in the making or early career or mid-career cardiologists. It's a podcast for the cardiology community, but I'm sure a topic like this transcends all specialties and is unfortunately ubiquitous. But any closing remarks for this conversation we had today and for the academic parity movement?
Yeah, the only thing I would love to mention is that as members of the scientific community, we all need to feel responsible and responsible to what's happening at our science backyard. So the only way we can basically address this issue in a timely and effective manner is collective actions that all of us can do. If we see a bullying behavior as a bystander, we should do something. If we are journal editors, in your case in cardiology, we need to consider the fact that our audience deserve to know about bullying and harassment behaviors in their community as well. So pieces on academic bullying and harassment are not out of the scope of any journal. In fact, issues of racism, gender imbalances, and academic bullying and harassment are the scope of every journal. So they can contribute to increase awareness about the issue. So long and short of it is, in all positions that any member of the scientific community have, they can contribute. They can feel responsible and, like I mentioned, responsible to this issue. And if all of us do something, I'm sure we can make the environment unsafe for bullying and harassment behavior. So perpetrators basically try to either fix their behaviors or leave academia.
Susanne, any closing remarks from you?
Yeah, well, maybe just a shout out to all the scholars out there. Oftentimes it's junior scholars affected. If you're out there, if you're listening to this, if you're affected, just know it's not all in your mind. You are not alone. We are there for you. If you need to talk to anyone, feel free to reach out also to the academic parity movement, connect, because I do really agree with Morteza. We are academia, so we can make this stop this behavior, and we have to stand in solidarity with each other.
Yeah, no, excellent. And, I'm only grateful that, Parallax and Make a Dent can be a beacon for spreading this message, across the cardiology community. And I hope that this episode gets downloaded several times and all over the 60 countries that were downloaded in. And I hope that people reach out to the academic parity movement and to you and seek counsel and help. And, thanks again for doing this for us at such a short notice. And, it was a delight to speak with both of you. Thank you.
Thanks for having us, Ankur.
Yeah, no, my pleasure.
We hope you enjoyed today's podcast, produced by Radcliffe Cardiology in association with makeadent.org. We aim to bring you a new angle of all things cardiology every second week. Review us on your favourite podcast app or send your comments or questions to podcast@radcliffe-group.com. To view the series, head to radcliffecardiology.com/podcasts/Parallax. Thanks for listening.